Six p.m. in the Russian capital Moscow, in London 4 p.m. and in Washington 11 a.m. I'm Estelle Winters.
Now, staying with the Syrian crisis, Russia has no comments regarding media reports of US President Barack Obama proposing military cooperation and fight against terrorism in Syria. That's what Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said on Friday following the news of the alleged offer. According to the Washington Post, the Barack Obama administration has proposed a new agreement in Syria to boost military cooperation with Moscow against some terrorist groups. That comes in exchange for Russia persuading the Syrian leadership to stop bombing US-backed rebels. However, the offer reportedly does not include joint military planning, targeting, or coordination with US airstrikes or other operations in Syria.
Well, to discuss this further, we're now joined live on the line by Dr. Joseph Fitsanakis, Assistant Professor of Political Science in the Intelligence and National Security Studies program at Coastal Carolina University. Thank you for joining us here at Welcome to the Show.
It's my pleasure to be here.
As part of Russia's rapprochement with Ankara, Turkey has said that it supports Russia's stance on Al-Nusra Front, and also that it's necessary for moderates to withdraw from the positions held by radicals. Now, some analysts are pointing out and have already called this a breakthrough deal that could turn the tide in the conflict. But what do you think?
I think it's definitely an interesting development, but I would add to this a note of caution. I think Turkey has shown in the past, the recent past, that it's an unpredictable country at the moment with an equally unpredictable foreign policy. I mean, remember that it began a few years back by essentially turning a blind eye to the rise of ISIS, but then he almost went to war with Russia by downing a Russian plane that was engaged in the Syrian war. Then he changed his mind, apparently, and allowed some Western countries to use its air bases to strike targets in Syria and in Iraq. And now he seems to be siding with the Russian position. But in reality, I think most of these maneuvers are aimed at a domestic audience within Turkey. And because the domestic political situation in the country is very unpredictable, very unsettled, I wouldn't yet make the point that it's a game-changing development. I think we should sort of be cautious and wait to see what happens with Turkey.
Have I got that right, that you think that this is intended almost as sort of like a propaganda thing for the average person on the street in Turkey?
It wouldn't be the first time, especially in this very volatile situation within the country. I mean, I can't think of many countries in the region that are more unsettled and unpredictable right now than Turkey.
Let's go back now to that interview on Australia's SBS with Assad, and he accused the Western countries of double standards, and he said that they prefer to negotiate with him in secret as they don't want to upset the United States. I mean, taking this into the equation, one asks, I mean, will some of these behind-the-doors talks, I mean, would they ever perhaps turn into a bigger dialogue?
I think that's quite unlikely for the foreseeable future. There is a tremendous amount of bad blood between the warring factions in Syria. There are too many actors actually on the ground that cannot be controlled by a central source. My take on this is that negotiations are likely to continue in secret for the time being until some kind of major breakthrough is made, perhaps at some point in the future. It's more likely to see something like what happened in Korea in the 1950s, where at the end of the Korean War, there was some kind of a tacit agreement to stop shooting at each other. But the war never technically ended. I think that's what is more likely to happen in the case of Syria than an actual, above-the-ground negotiation with all parties coming together. I'll also remind you that many of the moderates on all factions in the Syrian war have pretty much abandoned the war at this point, have left the country, gone to places like Turkey, Europe, Arab nations, etc. And so what's left on all sides are sort of the hardliners. So we're actually more likely, I think, to see some kind of an open agreement between Washington and Moscow with a tacit support, but undeclared support by the Assad government and the opposition, with the exception, of course, of ISIS.
You mentioned there just Moscow and Washington might eventually come to do something, but I mean, we've had leaks, haven't we, recently from the Washington Post and the Obama administration proposing a new agreement in Syria to try and boost military cooperation with Moscow against the terrorist groups, but Moscow didn't comment.
I wouldn't expect them to comment. In fact, Washington will not comment either on this. I will, however, say that I think these reports are highly credible. I think they're being confirmed from many different sources at this point. And they do fall within the pattern of what is actually happening on the ground. There have been negotiations between Russia and the United States from the very beginning of this conflict, even though the narrative in the media points to the opposite direction. In reality, these two countries have been in direct talks with each other. I mean, there have been, deconfliction talks from the very beginning between Washington and Moscow. The two countries are part of the international task force that's pressing for a peace treaty within Syria. The idea is that if that would happen, then all sides could perhaps focus their attention to ISIS. Back in the spring, Russia actually proposed joint airstrikes against some of the al-Qaeda-linked factions. The U.S. didn't agree to that, but there have been a lot of negotiations between the two countries. I will also make the point, which is not very much discussed, but it's true, that on the ground there is a considerable degree of cooperation between American and Russian intelligence agencies in Syria, and also some cooperation between their armed forces, especially the Air Force.
There seem to be so many pieces to this jigsaw, don't there, Joseph? And then, for instance, we saw the shelling of that UN humanitarian convoy near Damascus recently.
Right, and I think that points to the fact that there are really no good sides in this war. I mean, every side has completely disregarded humanitarian law, international conventions on the conduct of troops. The U.S. has found itself often in an uncomfortable alliance with Sunni Islamists in Syria. The Russians, again, have no deep attachment to Assad himself. I mean, he's a highly disreputable and problematic figure, both within Syria and internationally. But, I mean, the Russian position has always been that, if Assad was removed, it would basically be the end of order in Syria, and that Assad is the only source of stability in the region. They want to avoid what happened in Libya back a few years ago. And it's interesting, over the past couple of years, I mean, the U.S. policy has moved closer to the Russian position because of the rise of ISIS. And now Russian policies are kind of moving closer to the American position, which is that there needs to be some kind of a peace treaty so that everybody can sort of recalibrate and focus on ISIS. The fact is that without a peace treaty in Syria, the rise of ISIS just cannot be contained. It cannot be stopped in any sort of meaningful way. And I think both sides now are coming to the realization that this must happen.
And what do you think we will, in the long run, see with Assad?
The situation right now in Syria, it's in a sort of a desperate stalemate. All factions are getting very tired of this incessant war. We've had close to 500,000 Syrians who have died in the war. Half the population of the country has left or been displaced. There are millions of Syrians that are fleeing to neighboring countries and, of course, to Europe. Assad, I think, realizes now that he just cannot reconquer all of Syria. There's no way that Assad can ever put Syria back together. The opposition also knows that. The opposition realizes that they cannot, at this point, take all over Syria, so there's no winner-take-all scenario. All factions are getting very tired, worn out by this sort of endless mayhem in Syria. So I think that's usually what happens historically, that prompts all sides to come to the table. When they get tired of shooting at each other and dying and so on and so forth, it's the right moment for peace. And I think we are kind of close to this moment now in the Syrian Civil War.
Joseph, thank you. Joining us live on the line there, Dr. Joseph Fitsanakis, Assistant Professor of Political Science in the Intelligence and National Security Studies Program at Coastal Carolina University.
24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there.
Moving on to other stories, German special services know about at least 7